All right, we are waiting just another minute to see if we can admit a few more people. We're expected to join.
Mary, just say if you want me to put up the agenda or anything.
I need to go through the announcement. So I will call the meeting to order and begin by reading the announcement from the governor. For this meeting, the Coastal Resilience Advisory Committee is convening by video conference via the Zoom app as posted on the town's website, identifying how the public may join. Members of the public wishing to participate in the meeting must use their full name for Zoom access. If full names are not used, people will not be allowed to participate in the discussion. The town reserves the right to remove any member of the public from the meeting who doesn't use a full name or acts inappropriately. If you do want to offer a comment when public comment is solicited, please either raise your hand using the Zoom control or send a chat message to either Vince or to me, Mary Longacre, as the chair, and we will recognize you when we have time to do so. I'm Mary Longacre.
Mary, you're muted.
Little accidental switch there. So let me begin again. To get started, I'll confirm that all members and persons anticipated on the agenda are present and can hear me. Members, when I call your name, please respond in the affirmative. Gary Beller.
Present.
Sarah Boyce.
Present.
Peter Brace.
Here.
I don't see Graham. She may join us. I think she said she was going to be late. Matt Fee.
Here.
Ian Golding.
Here.
Fritz McClure.
Here.
Jen Carberg. Sorry, I got out of order there.
Here.
And I'm Mary Longacre. Staff, when I call your name, please respond. Vince Murphy.
Here.
Chuck Larson.
Here.
And I don't see Holly. Is that right, Vince? Okay. And then anticipated speakers on the agenda. When I call your name, please respond. Sam Kefferston.
Present.
Kimberly Rose.
Present.
Trevor Johnson.
Here.
Trevor's just connecting. Okay. And we also have, do we have Heather Sprague with us as well?
Here.
Thank you. And also representing Arcata's Kate Edwards, although she is not anticipated to present. So this open meeting of the Coastal Resilience Advisory Committee is being conducted remotely, consistent with Governor Baker's executive order of March 12th, 2020, due to the current state of emergency in the Commonwealth due to the outbreak of the COVID-19 virus. In order to mitigate the transmission of the COVID-19 virus, we have been advised and directed by the Commonwealth to suspend public gatherings, and as such, the governor's order suspends the requirement of the open meeting law to have all meetings in a publicly accessible physical location. Further, all members of public bodies are allowed and encouraged to participate remotely. The order, which you can find posted with the agenda materials for this meeting, allows public bodies to meet entirely remotely so long as reasonable public access is afforded so that the public can follow along with the deliberations of the meeting. Ensuring public access does not ensure public participation unless such participation is required by law. Time permitting, this meeting will feature public comment. Please note that this meeting is being recorded and that all attendees are participating by video conference. Accordingly, please be aware that other folks may be able to see you, and take care not to share your screen. Anything you broadcast may be captured by the recording. All supporting materials that have been provided members of this body are available on the town's website unless otherwise noted. The public is encouraged to follow along using the posted agenda unless the chair notes otherwise. Before we move to the first item on the agenda, I will cover some ground rules for effective and clear conduct. I will introduce each speaker on the agenda. After they conclude their remarks, the chair will go down the line of members, inviting each by name to provide any comment, questions, or motions. Please hold until your name is called. Further, please remember to mute your phone or computer when you are not speaking, and please remember to speak clearly and in a way that helps generate accurate minutes. For any response, please wait until the chair yields the floor to you and state your name before speaking. If members wish to engage in a conversation with other members, please do so through the chair, taking care to identify yourself. For items with public comment, after members have spoken, the chair will afford public comment to those members of the public who have joined the meeting via Zoom. Members of the public who wish to speak must state their names and be acknowledged by and speak through the chair. Finally, each vote in this meeting will be taken by a roll call vote. And also for members of the public who are not able to speak, a reminder that you can submit comments to Vince Murphy through his town email address, vmurphy@nantucket-ma.gov. Thank you. And turning to the first item on our agenda, we have announcements. The first is that there is a second meeting with the Coastal Resilience Advisory Committee this afternoon at 4 o'clock. It's a joint meeting with the Select Board and with members of town staff. And that is a discussion on the Baxter Road engineering feasibility assessment. So we will reconvene this afternoon. We also have the announcement for the Resilient Nantucket Designs for Adaptation. That community forum is coming up soon, and I hope that people will register for that. There is a link in the agenda. Vince, you have a comment? Oh, great. Did you want to add anything, Vince, or just show the website?
Yeah, just wanted to show this, and I'm going to put this link in the chat, and you can scroll down and you have to click on each of the 3 individual links to register for the individual dates and times on the 22nd, 23rd, and 24th. Thank you.
Oh, great. Thank you for the clarification, Vince. That's a good reminder. We've registered 3 times. Any further comments on the Resilient Nantucket? Okay. Also a note that Acclimate maintains an event calendar that helps you follow events related to coastal resilience in Nantucket. Our next announcement is a recap from the Envision Nantucket, Envision Resilient Nantucket Challenge. Kimberly Rose is here to tell us a little bit about the recent speaker series. Thank you, Kim.
Thank you, Mary. So we had the last 3 weeks have been really interesting conversations, and it just wrapped up. So week 8, we heard from Rob Lampert, who's basically breaking down how policy was made and how that's not going to work traditionally for climate change, and how traditionally policy is predict, then act. You're predicting a future, then acting on what that prediction is. And climate change, it's a little uncertain and you don't know what's going to happen. So you can't really use that model. So what he suggested was a robust decision-making model of multi-scenario and objectives with a framework of different strategies for different potentialities for the future. And it was a very interesting conversation. And then AR Sliders basically brought in to, okay, but who are we making that policy for? Are we making it for a certain population who's going to benefit, who might face the repercussions of this policy or this particular action? And just kind of brought it home, and then also talked a little bit about how public art can raise awareness about trade-offs. The next week after that was on policy. So kind of transitioning from that, how is policy made, to, okay, what is a takings? What are those ground root law that basically land use and preservation use? And that was broken down by quite a few people, and basically looking at coastal law, but also land use law, and then got into at the very end on preservation law. And how they all kind of coincide with each other and work together. And then the last week, which was probably the most terrifying, because he called on people, because he's from Harvard Business School. And so it was a lot of, oh, you answer this. And you're like, I have no idea. There's a lot of numbers, but it was about real estate and how we can help the statistical financial stability of real estate with building in resilience and the adaptive capacities of both our natural and built environments. And it was a very interesting conversation that had a lot of numbers that are a little scary. So I had to watch it a few times to fully understand what was happening. But all 3 of those lectures and every lecture before that are available online. So if you ever want to watch them or need a refresher, then those are available to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim. And we do have that link in the agenda as well to get to the speaker series. Next, we have a report from the Nantucket Youth Climate Committee. They held a climate cafe, and Sam Kefferston is here. He was part of the sponsoring organization. Is that right, Sam? Mass Audubon?
That's right. So I wish the students were here to provide this update themselves, but luckily they took immaculate notes so I can share them. And Mary, you were there, which was great to have you as the resident expert. So we had about 15 participants in attendance. And some of the questions and discussion included, we presented that virtual meeting in the box the students had. And some folks had asked about, programs that were available to identify if your home is at risk, which Mary pointed them in the right direction. Also, how would you rate concern for climate change among youth in regard to other topics? What would Nantucket High School students like to see the town do in regards to climate change? Updates in general on the CRP process. Concern over impacts to coastal habitats and the organisms that depend on them, as well as just efforts to preserve the natural beauty and character of Nantucket and making sure that that's able to be shared with future generations. And then for issues in the neighborhood, some of the students and other attendees shared some touching stories about previous storms and realizing how far inland is affected during storms, not just those directly on the coast, that the population and infrastructure of Nantucket has grown immensely since the last serious storm that hit the island in 1991. I can't remember the figure exactly, Mary, but I hope you can chime in and remind me because it was striking.
It's almost 50% of the current number of buildings and the current population are new since 1991.
Yeah, it's still incredible. And the last, which was a great discussion, is considering the costs and challenges to minority communities in the face of climate change on Nantucket, and how we can engage these underrepresented communities in the CRP process. And Mary had let us and other attendees know that there's a Spanish translator available, and some of the other steps that Crack and the team behind the Coastal Resilience Plan is taking to make sure that happens. So those are the updates from the Youth Climate Committee in Mass Audubon. Thanks for your
Great.
time.
Thank you, Sam. I think there's another event coming up. Do you want to give us a quick shout out on that?
Absolutely, yes. So we have our Youth Climate Summit. That's going to be taking place May 19th. We haven't settled on the time yet, given there's some changes to the school schedule. They might be going back full time, but save the date, May 19th, more to come. Day of climate education and empowerment for the students of Nantucket.
Great, thank you very much, Sam.
Thanks,
Trevor, did you want to offer a comment? I'm really glad that the Youth Climate Committee was able to use the meeting in the box that Arcadis provided for us.
No comment. I mean, I just appreciate, Sam, you're taking the initiative to utilize that tool. Really happy to see it getting some traction and use on the island. I think Vince has shared it with a few other folks who we hope use it as well. And would really be, I'm not sure if you were able to use the Google form to upload your notes, but if not, Sam would love to just connect on the key outcomes there.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a great tool and very intuitive and user friendly. So it
Great.
Really cut out a lot of research on our end. So thank you for that.
All right. So the next, we are moving to the Coastal Resilience Plan project team's presentation of the mid-project report. So Trevor, you and Heather are here to do that. Vince, do we need to have Trevor share a screen, or are you handling that?
Trevor can share, and I've also given all the other Arcadis, other project team staff the right ability to share.
All right, go ahead, Trevor.
All right, thanks, Mary, and to the rest of the Coastal Resilience Advisory Committee. We're very excited to be here to share our mid-project update with you today. I know that the draft report was included in your packet, so hopefully you've had a chance to at least skim it in advance of the meeting. What I'll go through today is kind of just an overview of what's contained in that report. and just kind of make sure that you have the key kind of takeaways. The report is, as you know, kind of the mid-project report. It's not the final CRP or the final statement on anything that's contained there. It's just sort of an update on where we stand at this time. So really looking forward to your questions and feedback on what we've included, what we've worked on so far, and then use that as a basis for the sort of second half and next phases of the project where we turn towards the solution development. So with that, let me share my screen. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to present. Can someone let me know that they can see my PowerPoint screen? Great. What I'm going to do is I'm going to present about half of this presentation, and then I'm going to pause for questions. Which screen are you seeing? The back or the main presentation or the presenter view?
We're seeing the main presentation.
Okay, great. So I'm going to present about half of this presentation, and then I'll pause for Mary to facilitate questions and comments, and then I'll move through the second half of the presentation, if that sounds okay. So great. So firstly, we have our project mission. I just want to give a refresh on this before diving into the presentation. The CRP, what we're really driving towards here is to draw on the cherished, built and natural heritage of Nantucket to create a community-supported roadmap to implementation for a series of layered flood control and adaptation approaches. We're going to coordinate with other ongoing adaptation and sustainability initiatives, island and county, while respecting the unique characteristics of each neighborhood, and will be driven by the inclusive and equitable engagement of all to create social, environmental, and economic benefits and value to everyone who will share in Nantucket's future. So as I mentioned at the outset, the objectives of this update are first to provide you and the community with an update on where we are in the CRP process, update you on our key findings so far, identify missing information or open questions for additional exploration, and establish a basis for the next phase of the CRP process. So this is kind of an overview of the questions that we've examined before, and there's kind of three categories of work that we've undertaken in the CRP process. First is existing conditions analysis. Second is coastal risk assessment, and the third is community engagement. So on existing conditions, this is really for our team a process of getting to know the island, learning about it, learning about the services, facilities, systems and infrastructure that support quality of life on Nantucket. We know that Nantucket obviously is an island, and life on Nantucket is not the same as it is on the mainland. So it's really important that we understand exactly what the essential and critical services are. And we ask questions such as, where are the services and infrastructure located, which are essential to community well-being and which are essential to safety, thinking about kind of critical facilities. We talked about that during our last meeting in January. Who owns and operates these systems, and then what are the potential weak points in these systems that could make the community more vulnerable. Then we use this to inform our coastal risk assessment. So we start the risk assessment, as we'll talk about more over the course of this presentation, by looking at the coastal hazards that will affect Nantucket and how these hazards are projected to change over time. So what do we know about these hazards and what don't we know? It's very important to sort of understand the degree of uncertainty that exists when we're thinking about future climate change projections and what decisions we can make based on that uncertainty or including that uncertainty. What data do we have to support decision making today? We want to understand what the total risk to Nantucket is from coastal hazards, as well as how that risk deviates or changes across the island and across time. And then the facilities services that support community well-being and quality of life. What is the risk to these essential facilities and services? And then the third piece is community engagement, which we've worked a lot on with this committee to date. So we ask questions like, what are the aspects of Nantucket that are most important to preserve? What concerns does the community have about coastal risk? What does the community envision for Nantucket's long-term future? who are the key players that we need to engage to drive implementation of the CRP, and how can we talk to them early in the process to make sure that they're equipped with what information they need to be able to hit the ground running at the conclusion of the planning process. And then we think about the core tensions and conflicts that may not be resolvable within the context of a coastal resilience plan, but that need to be accounted for in the process of developing scenarios and solutions. And then how can we effectively engage the community throughout this process? So just an update on kind of overall where we are in the process. Not surprisingly, at the midpoint review, we are basically at the midpoint of the project. So we started in October. We're now at the beginning, well, almost mid-April with our mid-project report. And this is really a pivot point for us where we're wrapping up the existing conditions analysis. We've conducted about half of our community engagement. And we've are in the process of beginning to wrap up our coastal risk assessment. Although, as I'll talk about later, that is a piece of work that will continue to unfold and be refined throughout the process here. And then we'll be pivoting into the next phase of work, which is actually developing adaptation scenarios that will then become specific projects that we'll do implementation planning for. That will all be contained in the final CRP scheduled for delivery in September of this year. So I'm going to talk now about our existing conditions analysis. A lot of work has already been done on Nantucket, and as we talked about in prior plans, our goal is not to replicate or duplicate that work, but rather to build on it and to use it to inform a robust analysis. And so that being said, we also need to understand the island, and we can't just rely on work that was done in prior studies. So our process here is really kind of 4 areas of work in terms of existing conditions. First is talking to the community, as we've done through a number of our engagement steps so far. We do know that obviously the folks who live and visit and work on Nantucket know it best, and so one of the most efficient ways to learn about it is to speak with those community members, and we've done that through our kind of phase 1 and phase 2 community engagement, as well as our meetings here with you all on the CRAC. The second step is mapping. So we do undertake a pretty intensive process of collecting and reviewing available spatial and GIS data, and use that to kind of spatialize and understand the island. And that's a process of really drilling into the data and asking questions about what does this infrastructure represent? What are we missing? What do we need to go track down? That's an ongoing process that will probably continue throughout the project here, but we have a good handle on much of that data and much of the spatial information today. The third piece is analyzing risks. This is a coastal resilience plan, sort of a comprehensive plan for resilience of the waterfront. There's a lot of information on the island. Some of it we're not able to look at. Much of it that is, more infrastructure and data that might be more related to the mainland or the sort of upland conditions on Nantucket. And so we do focus our efforts on those areas that are most vulnerable or most at risk on Nantucket, which is a considerable area, as you'll see later. And then synthesis, so kind of bringing it all together, and that's really what the mid-project report gives us an opportunity to do very productively. So I would say to bring together all of the work that we've done so far into maybe not a concise statement, but a statement of some sorts that kind of summarizes our synthesis of the information that we've gathered so far. So I'll just walk through some of the maps that we've developed around existing conditions. In the report, there are sort of synthesis summaries of our understanding of these systems. We focus on first the risk. So we know that we need to drive towards a plan that addresses and promotes resilience and adaptation in areas that are at risk to coastal hazards. So we begin by looking at the risk. This is today's exposure to coastal hazards across Nantucket, including both flooding from monthly tidal conditions, as well as coastal flooding from storms. You can see, we've shared these maps through the open house in different format. We've shared these maps in our open house before. And then we look at the future risk. Apologies, these maps might take a moment to come forward. Yep. So then we look at the future risk. So what does tomorrow's exposure to coastal hazards tomorrow look like? And how is that changing over time? And how does that differently affect the existing conditions that we see today? And so we look at different categories. The first is starting with kind of the very basic environmental conditions. This is a map of Nantucket's topography and bathymetry. We see this in most of our projects, but it is remarkable to see the extent to which the floodplain lines up with those areas that are most low lying and which in some cases have been recently filled, or recent areas that have most low lying across the island. And this shows the sort of topography today, as well as the 100-year storm or 1% annual chance storm today. And then begin layering on the built environment. So one of the things that we heard a lot from the community through our early process is just the overall importance of the transportation network, both across the island today or intra-island, and also connections to the mainland. So we've taken some time to really understand that transportation network, the emergency access routes, evacuation routes, as well as the critical points of connection to the mainland, such as the Steamship Authority and Nantucket Memorial Airport. And then also looking at things like marinas and boat ramps, sort of the intersection of transportation, the economy, and public amenities, which are obviously central to the identity, the kind of maritime identity of Nantucket. Also looking at land use, so trying to understand where do we have existing built environment, what are the uses that built environment contains, and how does that intersect with risk? Obviously, as we'll talk about later, we have a significant amount of risk in downtown Nantucket, particularly to flooding, where we also have the most dense development across the island, and that's a challenge that needs to be addressed, and will be addressed through this project. But we also have other areas such as Nantucket and Pulpus Harbor, where there is significant development, existing development that is at risk of coastal hazards. And then regulations, obviously a central part of our mandate here, and our mission is to understand the regulatory frameworks that influence the built and natural conditions on Nantucket, and how those may need to change or adapt to account for future risks. So the first step in that is really understanding what the existing regulations say. And we obviously have a slew of different zoning districts across the island, which permit different densities of development, and we'll take a look at that through our solution development, but also the overlay of historic districts and where those exist. We also know that historic character is important outside of those districts, and that's another kind of feature that we'll be looking at. But the very first step is understanding the existing regulatory landscape today. And then infrastructure, much of this below grade, but how do folks on Nantucket get their energy? How do they get the water that they drink? Where does the wastewater go? Understanding these facilities, I mean, these are the kinds of things that many members of the community may take for granted, but that are truly essential to quality of life. And so understanding how these systems work and where they're located is really critical to ensuring that we do actually have resilient solutions that come out of the process. So that's the sort of overview of our existing conditions analysis. We'll talk more about some of that as we get into the risk analysis in the second half of this presentation. The second piece that I want to talk about, and we'll pause after this for questions and comment, is kind of what we heard. What have we heard from the community through the first half of our community engagement? So as you know, the first kind of phase was a series of briefings and interviews, a listening tour, if you will, across kind of key organizations, departments, boards, commissions across the island to really listen to what the critical concerns are, key concerns are early in the process. To date, we've, I think, had conversations with about 23 departments, boards, or commissions. Touched roughly 125 plus staff and community members through this process, and tried to cover a real range from the kind of key town departments, key commissions and boards, as well as some of the nonprofit organizations like NCF, who are really essential to the overall resilience of the island in terms of land ownership or stewardship of natural resources, and expertise on these issues. And then the second piece of our engagement has been really community-wide engagement, through which we have tried to engage a broader network of people who care and are interested about Nantucket's future. A couple of the tools that we've used for that are the first open house, which I think all of you attended. We had over 200 people register for that, and a little over 160 actually attend and participate. I think, as you saw, we had a presentation introducing the CRP, core resilience concepts, the risk, and then facilitated structured small group discussions around key conversations or key questions, like what do you value about living on Nantucket? What are the things that you'd like to see keep the same? What are you willing to change? And really visioning what do you want to see for yourself and future generations? And we've compiled a lot of that, much or all of the findings from that conversation into this report, and as well as our kind of background tracking. And then the second piece of community-wide outreach is the IRIS app, which hopefully all of you have downloaded and used. We have, as of yesterday, 88 users for the Nantucket CRP project. As we pivot into the next phase of the project, we'd really love to ramp that number up pretty significantly. So we'll be looking for opportunities for additional advertising and promotion of the app as we move forward, as well as additional surveying and updates to the app as we go. Do keep a note that we do push news to the app. So, for example, when we have a version of the mid-project report that we're ready to post to the town's website, we'll share that as a news event in the app, and that it is a place to go and check for recent news that's also posted to the town's website. And then the other thing I would just mention to Sam's earlier comment, we do have the self-guided meeting toolkit. That's a resource that we've developed and do hope to have folks use throughout the summer, throughout the spring and summer, I should say. We've had a few people express interest in that. Sam, I think, is one of the first groups to utilize it. I know Vince has used it with some town commissions, but definitely be as you're out in the community and talking to folks, that's a resource that you can direct people toward, and allow them to have a focused conversation on the CRP and share that information with our project team. So just to summarize kind of the high level key takeaways from what we've heard from the community, and this is a synthesis of all of the conversations we've had, whether with town boards and commissions, with organizations on the island, through the IRIS app, or through the open house. What we have here is kind of a synthesis of all of those conversations. So I'll start with the visions, because I think this is kind of the high level directionality that we've started to see through our conversations. And this is something that will continue to evolve, and I think we'll continue to get feedback on this. But this is where we stand today. So the first, I think, is that there's a sense that there is an interest in having the Nantucket of today be a place that exists in the future, and that young people and future generations can continue to enjoy. But that there's a I think a pragmatic realization that today's Nantucket will need to change in order to adapt to those new conditions. And to that point, the coastal resilience plans will need to be adaptable and dynamic in the long run. So change does not all need to happen. Change in the interest of making a Nantucket of today available to those who may live in 2050 and 2070 and beyond doesn't necessarily mean making every decision today about what will happen in 2070. So we need to create a framework that is adaptable and dynamic and can evolve to changing conditions. And as I mentioned earlier, that uncertainty in the long run. And then the other vision or sort of statement is that the town, I think, has an opportunity to really lead here, and to demonstrate leadership in the implementation of public projects that really set that high standard for resilience on town-owned properties and help to catalyze action amongst private property owners. And I think we may be able to extend the town here to also include some of the private nonprofit organizations that I think people also look to as leaders in this space. The idea of a multi-departmental approach, so really thinking about how can all groups or all departments within the town, commissions and boards and otherwise work in lockstep to achieve resilience across the island. One of the challenges or tensions that I'll talk about in a moment was a sense that there isn't really a coordinated roadmap. And to me, at least, and I think to the rest of our team, and this is something we've discussed with the CRAC as well, is the CRP provides an opportunity to create that consensus and create that framework for coordination moving forward. And then I think finally, and perhaps most importantly, is that there's an emphasis on a spirit of compromise is essential. There isn't necessarily going to be a solution that everybody finds for all areas that everybody finds to be ideal, right? And so there will be trade-offs, and there will be a necessity for groups and individuals to compromise to achieve the larger mission of a Nantucket that is a place for future generations to enjoy. Key priorities, and I think these are things that we heard loud and clear throughout the process, and that I think you'll see represented in some of our risk analysis data and how we approach the risk analysis for Nantucket. The first is that Nantucket is a special place. It has a one-of-a-kind character. It's special not only because it's historic, but also because it's an island, and there are a lot of constraints and opportunities that are associated with that, but that this character, needs to be preserved and needs to be recognized in the process of adaptation and resilience building. The second key priority is around nature-based solutions, and we could extend this to, an understanding risk to natural resources, but that wherever we have a feasible alternative that does leverage nature-based solutions, or solutions that are more ecologically friendly or provide more ecosystem services, we'd like to prioritize those over other types of more structural or solutions that may have may have environmental impacts or fewer environmental benefits. Prioritizing protecting critical infrastructure, I think is key. This is something that I think is kind of non-negotiable and baseline towards ensuring that Nantucket has people who visit and live and work on Nantucket have a safe place to be and are protected from natural hazards. And so focusing on things like the steamboat wharf and the steamship authority as critical infrastructure are essential to the overall resilience of the island moving forward. And then that the process needs to engage a diverse range of public voices. We definitely felt the sense that we need to do more to reach diversity of voices across the island, and we've been working to try to connect with some of the groups as well as town staff who may have more perspectives on how we can most effectively engage all Nantucketers. And as we move towards our second open house in the summer, I think we'd really like to drive towards having as inclusive an environment as possible, and as diverse a range of voices in that conversation as possible. And then finally, the CRP should be clear and actionable. So, you know, we start with the visions, but we're not undertaking a kind of thought experiment with the CRP. We're trying to develop a set of solutions that really provides a roadmap for the town and the community to move forward and take immediate next steps. And that's very much, you know, where we are, where we're headed in the next phase of this project. And then I think I started with the visions and the priorities, but that doesn't mean that there aren't challenges and tensions. And so just to touch on those for a moment, obviously the challenge that frames this whole project and that drives what we're after here is that the effects of flooding and erosion hazards are something that Nantucket has lived with since for all of history, but that the impacts of these hazards are increasingly being felt across the island. They're impacting quality of life, and with climate change and sea level rise will get worse over time. And so that's really the kind of the fire that lights the CRP and drives us forward here. We need, you know, there needs to be a greater understanding or public awareness about coastal risks, and then conversely or complementarily, what can be done about those risks. So increasing public awareness that, you know, these risks, just because you haven't seen water on your property today, for example, doesn't mean that you won't in the future. But you know, there are steps that can be taken proactively to address that risk at multiple scales, from individual private property owners to large organizations who may have an interest in the beach and the bluffs, to the town and the properties and oversight that the town has control over. I touched on this earlier, but you know, a challenge related to many parallel efforts and plans that are related to resilience without a central entity or coordinated process. I think the process of coordination began prior to the CRP, and the CRP, I think, is actually a reflection of an effort to be more coordinated, thanks to you know, Vince's position with the town and the establishment of the CRAC. So our hope is to kind of build on that momentum and continue to work with you all to figure out what's the best process moving forward in terms of ensuring that all efforts are kind of working in lockstep and toward a shared understanding of what needs to happen. And then I think barriers to implementation. You know, there's a number of, particularly for private property owners and residents, we heard that, you know, people experience a variety of barriers, from not knowing what to do, not having the information that they need to understand how they can protect themselves and their property, to perception that regulations may be impeding their ability to make changes to their property, whether building code or you know, wetland protection regulations. And that's not to say that those barriers don't have purposes in their own right and are there for very good reasons, but the perception of a barrier is causing inaction, and we see that as a challenge. And then lastly, in terms of kind of categories of what we heard are key tensions. Sometimes we refer to these as healthy tensions because they exist everywhere. And the process of identifying and talking about these tensions can be really productive in terms of drawing out a path forward and a way to compromise. That being said, some tensions aren't resolvable just within the local level alone. And one of those is the fact that, you know, there are different levels of government, and each level of government has control over different regulations. And for example, building code is largely controlled at the state level, and Nantucket's ability to have more stringent regulations, building code regulations, than at the state level is really hampered. And so that's a tension, and we need to look for ways for Nantucket to be able to control and influence the built environment in a way that is productive and resilient, you know, takes into account the fact that you know, we don't have the opportunity to control every set of regulation or every regulatory framework that exists or influences the built environment. There's a tension between the development practices and kind of norms of development on Nantucket today and what that future built environment needs to be in order to be resilient. And that's a recognition of the need to change the way things have been done in the past in order to account for future risk, particularly where we have development or buildings that are going to be there when that future risk is likely to occur. So looking at things like, you know, design life, how long is a building likely to be there, and not just looking at the risk today, but the risk in 2070 or beyond, when that building is likely to still be there. The town is understaffed and underfunded. There's a need for greater resources to really address the magnitude of this challenge. You know, this it's not easy to do, and the town, you know, I think has done a lot of work on a little so far, and we need to think about ways to ensure that the capacities are there, to make sure that staff is able to implement the plan effectively, but also to take advantage of, you know, state and federal assistance programs that, you know, especially with the new administration, may provide a great opportunity for Nantucket to be able to fund some of the recommendations coming from the CRP. Tensions around the preservation of the built character of the island and other priorities that some members of the community have around energy and food resilience, or resilience more generally. There will be a trade-off between, you know, how we preserve Nantucket today and the adaptation steps that may be necessary to ensure that that character isn't impacted by climate change and sea level rise. And then to that same point, that, you know, sort of resilience, adaptation goes hand in hand with sustainability and climate mitigation. So wherever we can, we should be looking for, in our resilience and adaptation approaches, looking for opportunities for co-benefits and creation of value in terms of sustainability benefits and, you know, reducing carbon emissions and offering opportunities to mitigate future climate change. And this is the final slide before I'll pause for questions and comment, a little bit about how this will inform the project's next steps. So I'll touch on this at the very end of this presentation, but the most concrete way that this begins to inform us is calibrating our resilience toolkit and the preliminary scenario development, which will be the next phase of the project. What we start with will not be starting in a vacuum. We'll be starting with a set of potential solutions that is really framed around what we've heard so far. It helps us refine the evaluation criteria and preliminary project prioritization scoring that we talked about back in January. And then it also helps us understand where there may be gaps in knowledge in the community that we need to address through an educational kind of perspective and through the CRP. And then also where we have an opportunity to generate and continue momentum. And then finally, the last piece is just continuing community engagement. So how can we, you know, everything that we've learned so far, how can we use that to ensure that the next steps of community engagement are undertaken as effectively as possible? Example is, you know, clearly we didn't have necessarily the most diverse turnout to our first open house. And so now for our second open house, how can we make sure that we take steps to ensure that we address those concerns moving forward? So I will pause there, and I'll even stop sharing my screen just so we can have a conversation about what we have so far. And I'll just say, Mary, the second part of the presentation is probably about a half an hour of me presenting, and then more time for question and comments, just so you can manage time.
Thank you, Trevor. Questions or comments from committee members? Yes, Sarah, go ahead.
Hi, thank you, Trevor, so much for presenting that. And I really appreciate the breakdown. I think we can all see now, I mean, speaking for myself, but can see what's already gone into it, where you're at, and kind of where you're headed. So my few comments are really just not nitpicky, but more editorial. So I work for the Linda Loring Nature Foundation, and I'm not representing them as part of this committee, but I mention it because several times, so our property isn't fully represented in the maps. And so half of our property, which is about 175 acres, is currently listed as multifamily residential, and it's actually open space and is owned by a private nonprofit. And only because of the size of the island, the 175 acres might make a difference, because it's actually the area that's excluded is in the area that is subject to flooding and is in the floodplain and is part of the more vulnerable area. So just in the future iterations, I think adding that in or changing that land use aspect will change some of the results. So I have like what pages and what maps, but I can send that later. I just didn't have a chance to read it before the April 16th deadline, or the deadline that Vince had. So
Vince, do you have a comment?
Yeah. So I've been looking at this as well recently, Sarah. I think this is a zoning question, and I don't think it's something that can necessarily be addressed by the Coastal Resilience Plan. So I don't know how Arcadis can influence how town zoning policy affects one property.
Please, Sarah, go ahead.
So it's actually like on page 34, it's not about the zoning, it's about whether it's considered residential or open space. And so it never was multifamily open residential. Even before we owned it, it was one house. So it wasn't multifamily, it was one house. So that's just, that I think that's just an artifact of the GIS layer in the town. Also, the ownership, it's more about ownership and not zoning. So like page 41, where there's the color coding that has like private nonprofit, public open space, that kind of thing, we're still listed as residential. So I'm saying it more as it's a help for what the ultimate impacts will be. It's correct in the sense of the maps where it's about land use, like where it's the habitat types and that kind of thing. So I think from my reading of it, it's probably just the older GIS layer that was used, because I do think it affects the total open space acreage and the impacted open space, particularly because majority of that 175 acres is wetlands that's inundated by Long Pond. And so I'm happy to, like, Trevor, talk to you at some point or specifically outline those properties, but that was one.
Fritz, go ahead.
Yeah, Trevor, I'm on the planning board. So this is, so I'm just adding a little bit, perhaps, and reinforcing what Sarah said. In fact, much of the land that is held in conservation at this time, including, and Jennifer can probably speak to this, Conservation Foundation land, is still carried for zoning purposes as residential or multifamily. It hasn't been converted to open space. And we won't go into the reasons for all of that or the logic. It's simply a fact. And therefore, to the extent, I agree with Sarah, to the extent that you're describing risks to certain, to residential development or whatever based on a zoning map, it's would probably have a tendency to, I won't say misrepresent, but it just inaccurately, not be completely accurate. So where you go about finding that example exactly, certainly the planning department, Andrew Vorse could probably help you identify that, but and I'll let Jennifer speak if she wants to, but I think most of the Conservation Foundation land is still carried as not as for zoning purposes as taxable residential, but I could be wrong in that. But much of the conservation land is, so that's just a fact.
Thank you, Fritz. Jen, did you want to add anything to that? No, okay. Other comments or questions from committee members? Gary, go ahead.
Yes, first of all, I thought it was a very well done document, splendidly done. And you got a lot of information in there and a helpful executive summary as well. what struck me most interestingly was the fact that at some point you referred to the impact in 2030. And even for someone, an old timer like myself, 80 years plus old, when you think about 2030, that's real life. You know, when people think about 2050 and 2070 and 2200, you say, well, okay, that could happen, but it's not going to affect me. But for us optimistic old timers, when you think about 2030 and you think that's only a certain number of years off, and you indicate in there how many inches of rise on these flood surges, I think it'll get a lot of people's attention, because that's close enough for people to start thinking about what are we going to do about that. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Gary. Trevor, did you have some responses?
Yeah, I just wanted to not lose track of some of the comments before I had a chance to respond. I think to Sarah and Fritz's comments, firstly, Sarah, happy to connect and make any corrections to the, we do leverage the available GIS data from the town. So there are going to be inaccuracies in that, of course, and we're happy to make corrections and provide more accurate data where we're able to learn about it. And then Fritz, just on the risk analysis, definitely does focus on existing buildings. So we're not looking at zone, like the potential for future development in the risk analysis. We're looking at what exists today in terms of buildings. So we wouldn't be misrepresenting the risk by looking at zoning, for example, and what could be built on property that is under a preservation or conservation restriction that wouldn't allow that development. And then Gary, I think that's a really good point in terms of making the case for action, particularly over the next 10 years, is that's a much more realistic time frame, and also the risks are perhaps more certain over that time. We know we have there's less deep uncertainty about the next 10 years than there is about 2070, and you can see that in the sea level rise curves that are tighter together, for the next 10 years. And then by the time you get to 2070 or 2100, you have a huge range of potential outcomes.
Thank you, Trevor. I'm glad you could update us on the methodology. Are there other comments or questions from committee members to this point? Yes, Sarah.
Just a quick question, and maybe this is more for Vince. Any other, because there's a few little kind of typo-y things that I know are so minor. Do you want those, Vince, or do we want us to send them to Trevor directly, or how is it best to kind of handle some of that?
Yeah, if you want to go through me and I'll forward it straight to Trevor as is, or if you want to send it to Trevor and copy me, whichever way it works, to be honest, Sarah, I don't mind. Just so long as the point gets across. And perhaps with Mary's indulgence, either now or later, we can discuss a date on getting comments in by. That's the chair's question.
Yes, so before we move on to the second section, Trevor, if you want to make a proposal there, and we can figure that date out, that would be great.
Sure. I mean, I think, let me know what's reasonable. I know it's a long document, and I think you got it on Thursday. So if we could, perhaps by next Thursday, the 22nd, that would be a 2-week review period. Does that seem reasonable to the committee?
I'm seeing a lot of head nods, so yes, let's agree to that.
Fantastic.
Thank you. And Trevor, if you want to go ahead with the second part of your presentation, and we'll save public comment until the full presentation has been made.
Great. All right, so I'm gonna share here again. All right, confirm that you can see the main PowerPoint slide here.
Presenter view there.
Oh, it's presenter view. All right.
There we go.
Oh.
Oh.
Is it right?
No, you had it the second time.
Oh, I did. All right.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. Let me just try again here.
We're still seeing the program. Now we're seeing the notes.
Okay. Is
There
that
we go.
better? All
That's-
right, great. Sorry about that. It's always a process, even a year later. So pause for questions and comments. Thank you everybody for those comments, and yeah, happy to take all comments on the report before we call it working final. So the next part of this presentation is going to focus on the risk analysis that we undertook, and I think we're really excited to talk about this. We think it moves Nantucket a lot further along in its understanding of cumulative risk than what has come before. We've looked at kind of the raw analysis of how many buildings, how much roadway, to different flood and erosion scenarios, but we also know you have a lot of understanding from that from prior plans. So what we've done is a much more robust analysis of cumulative risk, and tried to put that in dollar figures, which is really what's needed to understand and inform decision making from a benefit cost analysis standpoint, and understanding really what the cumulative cost of inaction for Nantucket will be over time. And Heather Sprague, my colleague from Arcadis, who is an expert in that realm, will talk more about that in a moment. But just to orient everybody to kind of the first piece of the risk assessment, which really starts with the hazards. So we're looking at 5 hazards, and we're looking in depth at kind of 4 of these through the CRP. So the first is tidal flooding. And tidal flooding, as shown in the picture here, is really the type of flooding that happens when there isn't a storm event. It's driven by sea level rise and astronomical changes. These are the type of flooding that occurs, during quote unquote king tides. Often referred to as, often causes what is referred to as nuisance flooding, which at first is flooding that looks similar to what you see in this image here, kind of ponding on roadways, low-lying roadways. But over time, with sea level rise, without changes to our built environment to adapt to those rising sea levels, will become increasingly disruptive over time, and not no longer considered nuisance. And to analyze tidal flooding, we look at what's called monthly high tide or monthly high water, which is for us kind of a barometer of when a flooding is transitioning from being a nuisance to really disruptive. We think that daily high tide, like mean high water, is really, if you're seeing water in a place every single day, that's more than disruptive, or that's more than a nuisance. That is really disrupting and reducing quality of life, and in some cases may make a place inaccessible to emergency vehicles, flooding homes and residences. It's no longer a nuisance. It's really a problem. Monthly high tide, which is a tide that may be exceeded around 25 times per year, is certainly disruptive and certainly a nuisance, but it gives time for action. So it's sort of giving us a head start in terms of knowing what areas are likely to be vulnerable to very frequent flooding in the future. The second piece is coastal flooding. Coastal flooding, or storm surge as it's sometimes called, is flooding that's driven by wind and pressure from storms. Nantucket is obviously no stranger to this type of flooding. This will be exacerbated by sea level rise, as well as more intense, potentially more intense and frequent storms due to climate change. And that is a different characteristic, a different type of flooding from tidal flooding, but they are related. And then the third kind of main hazard that we're looking at is coastal erosion, also driven by and exacerbated by sea level rise. This is a hazard that affects almost the entire island, but particularly the south and eastern shores of the island. And then groundwater emergence or groundwater table rise is kind of the forgotten coastal hazard often, but we think it's really vitally important to understand groundwater table rise because it presents a number of potential threats and is actually very challenging to mitigate. So the responses to groundwater table rise are very different than they might be to a tidal flooding, or coastal erosion. So we want to understand the kind of intersection of overland flooding and flooding or change that may occur through water that's coming through the ground. And then stormwater, we're not looking in depth at stormwater flooding through this study, but we are considering it in terms of how it can exacerbate flooding along the coast, particularly when sea level rise decreases the ability to discharge stormwater through outfalls. If an outfall is covered, it often is difficult for the stormwater to drain through gravity outward, and that can lead to flooding far inland, actually, depending on the drainage network. The other kind of consideration related to stormwater is that if the Coastal Resilience Plan does propose flood defense, ways of keeping the ocean out of the built environment, then there is also no way for water to drain out overland if it's raining as well. And so the need for pumping or ways of managing stormwater on the interior of a coastal flood defense are part of our design and kind of cost estimation process. So just talking about the hazards, how do these hazards get us to risk? So coastal risk, as I think probably most folks on the committee know, is a result of a calculation of the probability that a hazard will occur times the consequence of what will happen, what will be the impact of that hazard. So talking about erosion and tidal flooding and coastal flooding, as well as groundwater table rise. We look at the frequency of that event as well as the effects, the depth of flooding, for example, to get at the kind of probability of impact. And then that is multiplied by the consequence or impact of that. And that looks at economic, natural, and built assets exposed, as well as the cost of damage, as we'll talk about in a moment, and then service disruption and loss. And the way that we can't necessarily change the probability of a hazard happening in a meaningful way, but we can adapt to the probability increases in probability over the time, and we can build Nantucket's resilience to these risks over time, so that the impact or the consequence is lessened. And so the purpose of the risk assessment is kind of threefold. The first is understanding and help communicate risk, to help understand and communicate the risk to buildings, infrastructure, community assets and services, and natural resources across Nantucket due to coastal flooding and erosion today and the future. And this is, I think, drawing on the same kind of categories that we looked at through the existing conditions analysis. These are the things that support life on Nantucket, make the island an enjoyable place to live and visit, and that that we want to help preserve and make more resilient over time. We also undertake this analysis not just to help communicate, but also to make the case for investment, thinking about the cost of inaction. So by using a quantitative approach, we can assess the impacts of coastal flooding and erosion if no flood or erosion control infrastructure is built, and help to justify action that may be taken to mitigate those impacts over time. And then just in general, kind of understanding the long-term exposure to and losses from flooding and erosion across the island. If we understand kind of impacts over time, we're able to orient decision-making across time. So we know when things need to happen today, what things need to happen in 2030, what things may need to happen in 2050 and beyond. And that's very much when we get to the sort of prioritization and implementation roadmap towards the latter phases of this project. And this information is useful for a variety of different purposes. And I should say kind of at the outset here that what's provided in the mid-project report is really a summary of a large data set that's been developed. And we can look at that data in lots of different ways. We can really drill into specific areas. We can look at particular streets and neighborhoods. We can ask a lot of different questions of the data. And that's something, if there are particular questions that we think the community would really like to know, we're kind of all ears for that. For the purposes of our summary, we're looking at kind of the island-wide context and summarizing things at a very high level, but the intent as we get into the scenario development and project prioritization is to begin to drill in at a much finer scale to understand that risk. So the findings are useful for general planning. General planning is kind of what the CRP is in a way. It's helping to inform a large, island-wide perspective on risk and what we can do about that risk. And then, as I just mentioned, and related to general planning, scenario development and project prioritization. On scenario development, we can, look at how risk changes over time and begin to think about which areas may be, applicable or appropriate for a certain type of adaptation scenario based on its risk profile or the kind of concentration of risk, and which other areas may be suitable for a different type of adaptation scenario. And then project prioritization is really about where do we see a need for action today, where do we see a need for action tomorrow. Capital planning, it can be very useful for a couple different purposes. One is understanding which existing infrastructure is at risk today. So looking at roads and subgrade infrastructure, other kinds of critical facilities, where are the risks today is to help, where is the risk today and tomorrow in order to prioritize mitigation steps to preserve and adapt that infrastructure. And then also for planning for future infrastructure that doesn't exist today, but maybe needs to exist in the future. How can we plan for that infrastructure to be in the least vulnerable places possible? So, for example, there's, through a capital planning process, we could develop, a screening tool used by decision makers to help influence decision making based on current and future risk across the island. And then addressing the needs of the most vulnerable, we can use the risk analysis overlaying with demographic data and other kind of anecdotal understandings of the community to make sure that we're accounting for the fact that risk is not evenly felt by all, even if that risk is held constant, and certain folks have a greater ability to mitigate or address that risk on their own than others. So thinking about that equity perspective to make sure that we're addressing the needs of those who need it most. So with this, I'm going to turn it over to Heather, who led our coastal risk analysis and can help walk through kind of the more nitty-gritty details of what we undertake.
Thanks, Trevor. So our risk analysis investigates a wide range of consequences for each building exposed to coastal flooding and erosion hazards on Nantucket, including direct physical damage to buildings and their contents, human impacts like the per diem costs of meals and lodging for folks who are temporarily displaced from a flooded home, and economic impacts like the direct revenue loss that businesses may incur due to a flood event. Our analysis follows standard FEMA and Army Corps methodologies for these metrics, which sets us up for future potential federal funding strategies for mitigation projects. In addition to the building level impacts, we also look at regional, indirect, and induced impacts to the supply chain due to that direct economic loss that we've calculated. We also highlight the impacts on essential services in the community, such as to the Steamship Authority and the Stop and Shop downtown. For other transportation, ecological, and community assets, we performed an exposure analysis to start to get an idea of the qualitative impacts on asset function, such as accessibility around the island and ecosystem function. So we estimate these metrics for 3 different flood events, the 1%, 0.5%, and 0.1% chance storms at 4 snapshots in time from now until 2070, considering sea level rise and changing erosion risk. So the next phase of our analysis will incorporate additional impacts from more frequent storm events, such as hopefully the 10% storm, to really just kind of flesh out that suite of events that we're looking at. We'll also be refining our assumptions around buildings that are subject to repetitive flooding due to tidal impacts and a changing groundwater table. On the next slide, we talk about how once we have all of our consequences calculated for all of these different events, for all of those metrics, we need to bring it together into a more digestible and useful form. So the first thing we do is to determine the expected annual damages for each of those snapshots in time, which represents the integration of loss across the various probabilities for each storm event as illustrated in this graphic. We then use those snapshots to interpolate what the expected annual damages would be for any given year between now and 2070. We then apply a discount rate to each of those interpolated values to account for the time value of money, and ultimately sum them all up to give us the present value of risk for each metric at each building. And we use the same approach for risk analyses in Boston, New York, San Francisco, all across the country. It's a pretty standard practice, and again, helps set us up for future benefit cost analyses and federal funding opportunities. So at the end of the day, all the complicated math allows us to compare buildings of all different types across Nantucket that are exposed to many different hazards throughout the next 50 years, and understand which buildings or neighborhoods have the highest overall potential for loss if no mitigation strategy is employed. That I pass it back to Trevor to talk a little bit about the key findings.
Yeah,
Yep.
thanks, Heather. And I think the committee may have questions about this methodology, which we can address as we go through. But I think the difference, one thing that I just want to drive home is that, you know, we're really looking at the kind of accrued risk for each year for each building. So we're able to look at the total cumulative risk rather than just the kind of risk at any one time. And by thinking about all of, to go back one slide, this risk, by drawing on kind of standard FEMA and Army Corps methodologies for risk assessment, we're able to create dollar values that relate to specific building types and specific building uses, as well as values for all of these human impacts and economic impacts that may accrue from risk. So it's kind of like packaging the larger, both direct and kind of cascading impacts of flood risk to buildings into a manageable, communicatable dollar figure that addresses all of these potential impacts from flooding. And I would also just note that a tremendous amount of QA/QC or quality assurance and kind of checking goes into making sure that the GIS data, for example, that we got from the town in terms of building GIS data on buildings and assessors data, aligning all that and making sure that we have as accurate an estimation as possible of what every building on Nantucket contains in terms of use, and what type of building it is, so that we can associate it with a depth damage function, is a lot of work, and it is it helps us get to a really start to get to a really accurate estimate for the total risk to Nantucket. And so all of that leads us to some outputs, some findings about the risk. And what I'll say here is, as Heather mentioned, this is a preliminary findings, and we will continue to refine this as we get more data. Our understanding is that more additional information from the Massachusetts Coastal Flood Risk Model is going to be released this spring. We've set up a model for Nantucket that can incorporate this new data as it becomes available. So we do anticipate that some of these numbers may change, likely to increase the total risk on Nantucket, so that by the end of our project here, we'll have a more refined and I think even more fine-grained understanding of the total risk. But what we have today is, I think, a really strong start, and it gets us to really understanding the magnitude of the cumulative risk. I mean, we're talking about almost 3,500 structures at risk through 2070 to both coastal flooding and erosion, with a total of $1.2 billion in cumulative expected damages, which is a very large amount. It is partially a function of the very high real estate values on Nantucket. The cost of construction on Nantucket is higher than it is on the mainland, of course. But it's a significant number for a community of Nantucket size. And I guess in terms of driving action, it's a significant amount of loss that could be avoided through action. Much of the risk is driven by risk to residential buildings. So 86% of the at-risk buildings are residential, primarily private residential buildings. And this accounts for 68% of that $1.2 billion cumulative risk figure. But we also have a significant risk to the commercial buildings, and many of these buildings are located downtown and drive, I think, the kind of character and identity that people think of when they arrive in Nantucket. So 7% of the buildings are commercial overall by count, but that's accounting for a disproportionate 26% of the total risk. 41% of the buildings across both residential and historic categories are historic, either within one of the two local historic districts or have been inventoried by the Massachusetts Historical Commission. And those represent, again, disproportionately 64% of the total risk to the island. 7% of the buildings are tourism related. So we mapped buildings to particular kind of industries that we feel support tourism, things like car rental shops, hotels, restaurants. And so in terms of thinking about the risk to really the core industry that drives Nantucket tourism, we're looking at a significant amount of risk to that industry over time. And then essential facilities. So we did create an inventory. If you look at, I think it's the final appendix of the report, we have a kind of community assets and facilities inventory, trying to map everything on the island that really supports, in terms of services and community assets. Of that inventory, 33 of those facilities are at risk, and that represents $46 million in expected damages. So we'll walk through some of these numbers in a little bit more detail and talk about some of the spatialization of that. This map conveys kind of the spatial distribution of that risk across the island. The color of the graduated circles here correlates to the amount of total quantitative damage between today and 2070. And we have different hazard layers conveyed here as well. What you can see from this is that there's a couple of pockets of really concentrated risk, most significantly in the downtown area. Obviously, we have not just a density of buildings that are at risk, but also some buildings that have very significant amount of risk associated with them. Some of the larger buildings like the Whaling Museum and other larger buildings in downtown that are very vulnerable to risk over time really drive a significant amount of that quantitative risk as shown on this map. But other areas like Nantucket, Sconset, along the south shore of the island, where we have a number of private residences located in erosion hazard areas. These are areas where we have pretty significant pockets of risk across the island. One of the interesting findings, I think, and this may be a little bit related to the methodology, but much of the significant proportion of the risk on Nantucket is really driven by flooding in terms of quantification. So one of the reasons for that is that we're looking at the annualized risk of flooding. So the risk of flooding, probability of flooding in any given year, and accumulating that. And so that drives a significant amount of risk, whereas erosion is kind of looking at it as a one-time event. So for example, you're not really accruing risk of erosion until such time that your building is impacted directly by the erosion. And so it's not necessarily an annual accrual of risk, but a sudden one-time event, episodic accrual of risk. But what that means is that flooding kind of drives that risk. So of the 3,438 buildings on Nantucket, flooding is, represents 2,578. Over 2,500 of those buildings are at risk of only flooding and not erosion. We have 470 buildings that are at risk of erosion, but not flooding, largely located on bluffs. And then we have a subset of 390 buildings that's both at risk of flooding and erosion. And in those cases, what we've done through the methodology is we've calculated the risk of flooding up until such time that that building is impacted by erosion. And then we stop calculating the risk of flooding and account for the total loss of the building due to erosion. And this is, again, putting this in the context of, where, in terms of use, where does this risk accumulate? And as mentioned before, a significant amount of this is related to residential properties. 68% of the total risk is on residences, most primarily private residences. But we also have a significant 7% of buildings and 26% of total risk located on commercial buildings. And you'll see here that the third most is community facilities and services, but far behind. I think the dollar amount here may not be telling the total story in terms of the impact that these community facilities and services have on the community. That's why we've kind of looked at them in a different light as essential or critical facilities as well. Buildings supporting tourism. So here you'll see that a little over 200 structures total we've mapped to tourism. 26% of the total risk, 6% of the buildings at risk, and you can see that the majority of these, not surprisingly, are commercial structures. These are the restaurants and hotels, the places that folks who visit Nantucket may rely on and enjoy when they visit. And then community facilities and services and transportation. I think most of that transportation is related to the ferry terminal, Steamboat Wharf. I think one thing that's not included here, and it'd be interesting to think about, we did discuss this, was kind of the short-term rental part of this conversation. And short-term rentals like Airbnb and VRBO are not included here in a meaningful way, just because we don't have data on where those exist and which buildings may house short-term rentals, but certainly they help support the tourism economy. And so this number is likely to be an underestimation of what the total risk to tourism on Nantucket might be. Historic structures, as I mentioned, this is, there's an argument to be had that, the entire island is historic. The entire island is a National Historic Landmark. It is the built environment as well as the natural environment that contributes to that designation. But to start to get a handle on risk to historic structures, we begin by looking at the historic districts and the inventory of historic structures that's been undertaken by the Massachusetts Historical Commission. And we see significant, even with this kind of very basic analysis, given what we know on contributing structures, we see a tremendous amount of risk. 41% of the buildings that we look at are in these historic categories, and that drives well over half of the total risk on Nantucket. So there really is a strong need, a strong basis to think about what that means and how we respond to that risk to historic buildings. So that conversation really relates to structures and buildings. There's also a lot of other things on Nantucket that support life there. Firstly, we talked about the transportation network and the existing conditions, but one's ability to get around Nantucket, to access the things that people need to survive and enjoy their lives, are largely contingent upon the road network on Nantucket. And so we do look at this. This map kind of shows a combined risk to roads from both mean monthly high water or erosion. And again, we're looking at mean monthly high water because our view is that a road that's impassable 20 times a year or so, or at monthly high tide, is really untenable, an untenable a frequency of loss of service. And on that note about loss of service, we look at, in this analysis, we look at roads, we define loss of service as being flooded by 6 inches or more of water. You know, a strict kind of just intersection of GIS layers doesn't really tell the whole story, because it may just be saying that there's, you know, half an inch of water on a road, which is still a passable road. 6 inches is the point at which a small vehicle may begin to float, and would be the definition of a road that is impassable. And so that's what we look at as a loss of service here. And what we can see is that by 2070, we could see as many as 29 miles of road on Nantucket flooding with 6 inches of water or being lost to erosion. 29 miles lost to high tide, and an additional 23 miles of road at risk of loss to erosion. And then, you know, beyond that, as many as 63 miles could be at risk of having a 1% annual chance of loss of service, also by 2070. And also the bridges are very important, especially where we have in Nantucket in particular, the potential for isolation risk. And what we see is that, you know, up to four bridges in that area may experience loss of service due to monthly high tides by 2050. And to drill into that a little bit more, this is just a closer zoom map of that risk to both the roadways and bridges or water crossings. You know, in the case where we have culverts that will exist over time, and you know, today, you know, by 2030 we see 10 point. This is island-wide numbers, so not strictly Nantucket. But by 2030, we see 10.1 miles of loss of service to roads. By 2050, 20.3 miles. You know, by 2070, 29 miles. Sort of roughly 10-mile increase each kind of threshold. But then by 2100, we see a very large jump up to 45 miles of potential loss of service to roadways across Nantucket. And then erosion separately tells a slightly different story, but equally as important. Again, just showing a kind of a sub area here. We have this data for the entire island, and we'll be looking at it to, you know, answer questions as we develop scenarios. But, you know, again, significant risk to buildings across, roadways across Nantucket from erosion. By 2030, given current projections, up to, you know, close to 6 miles of loss. 2050, doubling that number to roughly 12 miles, and then so on and so forth, so that by 2100 we could see as many as 33 miles of existing roadway lost to erosion. And, you know, I think thinking about how do we address that, and there's a lot of different ways we can think about. You know, some roadways may not be necessary in the future, given where development can be, but some roadways may be very, very necessary, and they should be prioritized for you know, adaptation planning and different pathways for addressing that risk, adapting to that risk over time. On the transportation front, we're looking at, you know, the critical infrastructure. There's kind of 3 critical infrastructure components that frame our you know, our understanding of the ability to access Nantucket from the mainland. The first is the airport, of course, and while not at risk of flooding, there is long-term erosion risk. And it's not just to, you know, the infrastructure, but also the sort of property and the other facets of security that surround the airport. So we did look at the whole property here, and you know, we do see the increasing loss of land area. I know that there's a fence system that is out there required by the FAA that I think was impacted by recent erosion that happened this spring or summer or winter, getting my seasons mixed up. And so looking at this loss of land area is significant, because it does get us to understanding that by 2100, We see a little corner of the runway itself being impacted, and I think the time to start planning for how we adapt the airport to that long-term risk is today. And on that same kind of front, the Steamship Authority, and I think what's interesting about the Steamship Authority is that while in the long run, yes, the Steamship Authority is at risk of being overtopped during monthly high tide. It's actually more the access points that are vulnerable in the near term. And if you can't access steamship or steamboat wharf to take the Steamship Authority, well, then the asset itself is not very useful, and it's not providing its critical sort of service to the island. And so looking at this, we see that, by 2030, some of the roadways could be partially cut off at monthly high tide. Certainly by 2050, what we see is that, the wharf itself is going to be continually cut off or completely cut off from the surrounding road network at monthly high tide. And again, that's a real, very significant supply chain to the island, as you all know. In addition to being the way that many folks access the island. And so in terms of prioritizing action, this would be one of, I think, our first or most high priority areas to address. And on that same front, I talked about, the kind of community services and facilities being lower kind of in terms of raw dollar amount, just because there are a few of them on the island. That only tells part of the story. So we also look at, kind of ranking these facilities in terms of criticality or how essential they are to the community. And so this is a multi-step process. First, we develop an inventory of all of these community facilities and services. We then begin to rank them by criticality across a variety of categories. So, are they providing emergency service function? Are they providing housing, food? Are there some other aspects related to them that help support the needs of the most vulnerable? We kind of rank everything in a vacuum, not in a vacuum, without the risk. We understand, we try to rank things without understanding the risk. Then we associate each with a risk score. So I mentioned the Whaling Museum before, located downtown, vulnerable to flooding. In terms of ranking, it actually is the most vulnerable community facility on the island. Others are the concession building at the jetties, Stop and Shop, downtown, the Steamship Authority, and then other town-owned facilities. And just to mention this, the reason that, for example, the Jetties concession building is there is just because essential facilities includes all town-owned facilities. But then we combine the risk score with the ranking of criticality, and that's how we arrive at what we call a priority score. And what you can see here is that it's far and away the most high priority in terms of risk and criticality is the Steamship Authority, and that's a reflection of our understanding of how essential that facility is, but also the significant degree of risk that accrues there. Other important facilities that are high priority are the Sheriff's Office, the Stop and Shop located downtown, Coast Guard Station Brant Point, and then the Nantucket Town Hall and other facilities. And I'll just note that we have this full sort of rundown and ranking in the appendix to the report, or in one of the appendices to the report. We also looked at open space. So 17% of Nantucket's open space could be impacted by high tide by 2070. 26% of it could be impacted by coastal flooding at the 1% annual chance event by 2070. And we could see 10% of that open space lost to erosion by 2100. And this includes both private and public open spaces. And then finally, natural resources. We heard loud and clear the importance of understanding impacts to natural resources. I think as we get into the solution development phase of this project, we'll start to understand a little bit more specifically, what impacts to specific natural resources may exist. But this is our first kind of pass to try to get a handle on where we have exposure to natural resources. And I think particularly looking at more chronic issues or chronic flooding of these natural resources, where we might see wetland resources, for example, being submerged more regularly, and changes to the marsh habitats over time, and thinking about, how do we make space for marsh migration, and where may marsh migration be limited, and how can we address that through other types of interventions. But at a summary level, we see that by 2030, we could have up to 268 additional acres of wetland resource area, compared to today being submerged during monthly high tide, which is a significant amount of acreage that could be seeing changes to those ecosystems, and that number only grows over time. And then finally, groundwater. We did look at depth to groundwater today and into the future. Depth to groundwater is already decreasing across Nantucket. This is a preliminary desktop analysis. It is not necessarily going to get us to the site scale detail that may be necessary to really understand the impacts of groundwater emergence and changes to the groundwater table. But it does, for the purposes of kind of high level planning, it does start to tell some really important stories about where we may see wetland emergence, as I understand is already happening in certain areas of downtown. And the data certainly supports what's being observed in the real world with even our depth to groundwater today is relatively low in certain areas of the downtown, particularly in Brant Point. And by 2100, we could see very widespread emergence of groundwater in the downtown and really across many areas of the island. And this is the sort of thing that really drives, in terms of long-term scenario and adaptation planning, drives consideration of different types of solutions, because again, it's not just a question of keeping overland flooding out, but addressing water that's coming through the ground. And so where do we go from here? The first step is kind of identifying focus areas. So still in the process of this, but it obviously, I think, looking at this map starts to tell us, where do we see concentrated risk? Where is that risk coming from? And then beginning to zero in on, the specific questions we want to ask about when risk occurs, where specifically it's located at the kind of sub-district or site level, and then how can we begin to plan for this risk? So we'll look at, these areas that are shown kind of here on this map. The overall transportation systems. It's not just a question of areas, but also the larger systems that support access to those areas. Thinking about the prioritized facilities and services, and then open space and natural resources. And this is our next step. So just to give you a sense of our kind of process here, where we are now, or sort of in the process of, is the kind of development of refining of the vision for a resilient Nantucket, building on prior plans, our community engagement, and our understanding, current understanding of risk. We have our coastal risk, which again builds on what we know from the prior plans, the risk analysis that we just talked about, development of focused areas, and then continually refine and prioritize with community engagement. And then kind of our next step is refining our coastal resilience toolkit, which is based on expertise and local knowledge, refined with the risk and engagement and community engagement into actions, and then refined through scenario development. And we talked about evaluation criteria. This is kind of the lens through which all of this is passed through as we move to development of preliminary scenarios, which is the scenarios come out of the vision, the risk, and the toolkit. And the scenarios are really thinking at a higher level about what needs to happen or what can happen over time, where across the island. And what we look forward to doing is bringing these preliminary scenarios to the community during our next open house in the summer, to refine them and then kind of convert them into particular projects that can be prioritized for implementation over time. And this concludes the presentation. Hopefully I left a little bit of time for Q&A. Great, did. And just a reminder that, we really want to keep the conversation going. So look forward to refining and making final edits to the mid-project report and then sharing that out with the community. Please do promote it and let people know that it's been released. We'll be beginning to prepare for the open house number 2. I'll work with Vince to set a date for that and make sure that you all are aware far in advance, so we can begin promoting that. And then again, just the virtual meeting toolkit, that's a resource for everybody on the island to really use, but looking to the CRAC membership to help share and promote that. And then the IRIS app, as I mentioned earlier, will continue to be a tool through which we'll share information and look to engage the community throughout the CRP process.
Thank you, Trevor. So with the committee members' permission, let's postpone the minutes and the committee reports from the agenda until our next meeting. And I also want to move to allow some public comment before the committee members get a chance to respond, because we have greater access to the planning committee through regular interaction, and we've been asked to provide comments. So I'd like to give the public a chance to respond if there are any public comments. Can I get head nods from the committee members to proceed in that direction? Okay, not seeing anybody yelling and screaming. So if there are members of the public who wish to offer a comment or have a question, please let us know either by raising your hand using the Zoom controls, or if you're not able to do that, you can also send a message by chat. If you need to, go ahead and unmute yourself and just let us know verbally as well. And while we're waiting, Trevor, I did have a question. To what extent is the Coastal Resilience Plan able to address what happens to what you might call underwater land? So what happens to the harbor bottom? What happens to the offshore areas? Will there be impacts to navigation as we're losing sand because of erosion? Will there be impacts to shellfish habitat? Navigation both for recreational purposes and also for the survival aspect of the Steamship Authority and Highline. Is the plan able to address those sorts of questions?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, we certainly can make recommendations about what information would be needed to adequately assess those questions about, underwater lands, as you call them. And I think, if there's an interest in having us really drill into that, we can certainly look into what that would look like in terms of analysis. But, our focus, I think, has been on the mainland, the land, and risk to the, upland communities and built infrastructure. So I'd be interested to hear just a little bit more about what specific questions you may have, because there may be a way we can at least shape the recommendations from the CRP to help direct energies to follow-on studies that may be needed, like sediment transport studies, dredge plans, other kinds of in-depth technical analysis that may be needed to understand, how do we maintain shipping channels, and other other things that you mentioned.
Thank you. So I'm not seeing any members of the public with questions. Vince, did you receive any inquiry? No. Okay. Members of the committee, questions or comments? Well, I'll go ahead with another one. I appreciated the presentation today, Trevor, because it gave more context for the information in the report. A couple of questions that I wanted to make sure I understand correctly. So in the question of calculating dollars of damage, it seemed like that does allow for repeat damage to buildings. So a building might be damaged, repaired, and then damaged again, and that would be included in the calculation. Okay, great.
Correct.
And I think you mentioned that you were looking at Nantucket specific construction costs, not some sort of national average.
Yeah, we start with the national average, and Heather can chime in, but we did contact, so we're in contact with town staff about kind of average construction costs per square foot. So we factored in an inflation factor above, the average cost of construction on the mainland, which Nantucket is very high. I will say that much. It's higher than we see in a lot of, urban contexts. So that's driving a lot of that risk. Heather, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I guess just a little, wanted to clarify that different risk assessments might look at things in different ways, like maybe have a more Monte Carlo assessment of saying, here's this storm that's happening this year and then another storm next year and things like that. What we're showing is really it's kind of like a weighted average of damages that might occur in any given year. So it's not necessarily that a building may, and in a way, yes, we're saying that a building that might have been damaged in year one may also be damaged in year two. But I guess the way that we're representing this is more, what is the average potential of any given storm causing damage in these years, as opposed to kind of like repeated individual storm events. Does that make sense? I hope that I'm helping rather than confusing, but just wanted to make it clear that with the expected annual damage calculation that we're doing, it's more of a kind of a general approach as opposed to looking at individual storm events and saying, okay, this building was damaged last year, the 1% chance storm, and then we know another storm comes around next year. I feel like I'm
no, I mean, Heather, I think that's helpful, but the point is that to marry your question, that it's not assuming that damage to a building means that building is now removed from the analysis. It remains and continues to accumulate damage. But one of the things we actually do want to add once we have more hazard information on high probability storm events, and actually I was just talking to Heather about this yesterday, is there is a threshold at which a property is damaged so much or so frequently that it's not really tenable anymore, or it doesn't make, a rational economic actor is not going to continue to rebuild, after some threshold, right? And we can think about what that threshold is, but, kind of removing those buildings from the analysis so that they don't continue to accumulate risk and, sway the outputs.
Right, once the house has fallen into the sea, it's kind of off the.
Well, that we've already factored in.
You have, okay.
It's more that if a building is let's say is seeing water every single month, up to, let's say a foot of water in the first floor every single month or 20 times a year, I think we can make an assumption that somebody's no longer going to have a house in that location, and so we would want to remove it from the analysis. And so once we have more, once we get the rest of the package from the Massachusetts Coastal Flood Risk Model, we'll be able to start to factor that in a little bit more.
Great, thank you, Trevor. Committee members, Peter, please go ahead.
Yeah, I'm curious, at what point, or have you already notified the Steamship Authority and the High Line about those risks? I'm sure they probably already are aware of them, but then I'm wondering if they've already done their own assessments and how those assessments mesh with what we're doing here.
Yeah, I think we want to do focused outreach to the Steamship Authority. We did try to connect early in the process, weren't successful in that. I think they may be more likely to engage with us now that we have some information that may be valuable to them. So I think we'll work with Vince to kind of make sure that we're sharing that with them. It's interesting because, in some ways the Steamship Authority isn't the near-term problem, right? They may be able to mitigate their facility to reduce risk to the things that they control, but excuse me, that doesn't actually mitigate the risk or improve the resilience of the system, right? The system is people's ability to drive or access the wharf, and for trucks to come off of the boat and onto the mainland, right? So we got to think about the interdependency between the wharf and also the surrounding road network that may be controlled by the town.
Other comments or questions from committee members? Yes, Ian, please go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So it's very impressive, their progress so far, as I think we all agree. And in the historical perspective on page 27, there's a mention of the Preservation Institute of Nantucket. But I couldn't see any mention of their 3D modeling program for the downtown area, and which has some very graphic and I would have thought very useful images. I wondered whether or not you had any plans to incorporate any of those into the final report. Thank you, Mary.
Can I respond, Mary?
Yes, please, Trevor.
Yeah. I mean, the graphics are really provocative and I think tell a story that is, it really drives home the importance of action, right? And lets us know that this is real. We haven't included them here just because obviously we need permission from the Preservation Institute Nantucket, and we can think about, working with them to include some of those graphics. And, I think the final CRP, our team will look at, other types of visualizations similar to that, to help support, the public's understanding of not just kind of, in map view what this means, but also thinking about, rendering type graphics, photographic images like those visualizations do help tell an important story. So, the midterm project is not the full opportunity for us to visualize some of this information.
And thank you. May I follow up, please, Mary?
Yes, please, Ian.
So Marty Hyland of the University of Florida is, I don't know if you know him or have talked, he's the one, the driving force behind that. And it was done with CPC money, the Community Preservation Committee's money, starting in 2016. And I'm sure he'd be totally amenable to it. And I found out about it originally because of his projections for Cedar Key, and which had 3D modeling in Florida, on the west coast of Florida. And with Hurricane Herman, when it came in and devastated the community, his modeling was entirely accurate. And so I'd be happy to send emails to Vince if that would be a help. But otherwise, if you're already thinking it over, I've said my piece, and thank you.
Thank you, Ian. Other comments from committee members before we wrap up? Jen?
Thank you, Mary, and thank you, Trevor. This is really great presentation. I was able to skim a lot of the report before this, but not read it as in-depthly as I'm hoping to. I don't know if I missed this, if it just wasn't clear in my skimming of the document so far, but is there a plan to do any actual dollar valuation of the impacts to the open space natural features? I know there's the acreage in there, but as far as assessing risk, is that where the risk assessment stands as just the loss, or is there going to be a plan to do any kind of valuation, whether just for the natural resources themselves or, the protective pieces those resources could offer?
Yeah, I mean, so I think there's kind of two ways we can do it. One is, so the easiest way, or the most kind of straightforward way that I think we can absolutely do, is if we're able to get kind of a rough cost per square foot, for example, average or even park specific cost of rebuilding for different types of park spaces, whether it's passive or ball field or other kinds of amenities, we can absolutely look at risk to the open spaces and then, calculate very simply the overall cost of that damage to the town in terms of rebuilding. There's also another way to do it that is just much more time intensive and probably not as ultimately useful to our effort here, which is kind of a loss of service or loss of function calculation that it's a high level of effort. It takes a lot of work to get that right, and doesn't often necessarily tell us more than the cost of the damage. So yeah, I think we can absolutely at a minimum look at, associate those acreage or those kind of raw exposure figures with the cost of the town. And I can work with Vince and other colleagues at Parks and Recreation and other departments to try to get some estimate of what those dollar values might be.
Yeah, Jen, you want to follow up, and then I want to follow up on that question too.
Thank you, Mary. And thank you, Trevor. I appreciate that response. And I definitely get the complexity of trying to value natural resources. I think doing the first that you described would probably be important, just because I worry about, you know, seeing the risk to buildings potentially overwhelming any kind of response to the risk to open spaces. And the other reason I stress it is that I know when we did the MVP process, number 3 of, you know, the community's, importance on what they wanted to see on Nantucket was that restoration of, you know, coastal wetland resources as a buffer, for all of these things that we're talking about. And I haven't necessarily seen that enacted yet in the actions of the town in the response to MVP. So I'd like to see it reinforced within the CRP process if we can. Thank you.
Trevor, one idea that I had is you've measured, number of impacted acres of open space or conservation land. I think there are probably better ways to measure the impact, maybe number of endangered species who might be impacted in those habitats. I'm also curious if you're including pond ecosystems as well as land-based ecosystems when you're measuring the acreage. That might be changed due to salinity or drainage issues. But I'd like to see more context around the impact to the conservation land and open space, other than just a number of acres. And then just in general, X number of acres, X number of miles of road, what is that in context of the total that we have? Is it 1%? Is it 0.5%? Is it 20%? I think that would provide more information that help people figure out what the impact is.
Great, yes.
Do we have other comments? Yes, Matt, please.
Yeah, just to follow up on what Mary said, I think good suggestion, Mary, but I'm not sure if we want it to resonate with the public, they need to realize that they're losing their, they're losing their yards, that people want to know what's going to happen to them, and why can't I build a second dwelling here? Why can't I do a full basement? Why is it stupid to do a full basement? Why am I losing my yard? When will I lose my yard? Those are the kind of things that we need to sort of somehow make clear. When you look at the old, when you look at the pictures of Brant Point, not to pick on Brant Point, Gary, but when you look at not on purpose, but when you look at the old pictures, the wetland lines are straight, right angles. They've turned into lawns, and those are all going to turn back into wetlands, especially when the water table rises, which is, that whole thing frightens me. So anyway, people, we've got to make sure people realize what the impact on them is going to be for them to follow. When we start talking about, when we talk about the ecology and the birds and everything, and people, care about that, but they care about themselves a little more. So.
Thank you, Matt. Any final comments? Now, seeing none, I will take a motion to, Vince, you have a comment?
Sorry, Mary, I didn't mean to interrupt your motion, but there isn't necessarily a hard and fast time to end, and if other people did have comments, I don't see a reason to not keep going until quorum is lost.
Yeah, we're certainly able to continue taking comments, but if I don't see any, we're not going to sit here waiting for them. Yeah. So if anybody else does have a comment, last chance. And I'm not seeing any. So if a committee member wants to make a motion to adjourn, we'll entertain that.
So moved.
Fritz, I'm sorry, did you?
Well, before or after. I see Graham Dervis joined us, but I'm not sure when she joined the meeting. So for purposes of minutes, if somebody could give me an estimate approximately. So
I did note that, and Vince has it. It's 11:05.
11:05. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Jen, did I see that you had a comment?
Yes, thank you, Mary. I just wanted to ask a question before we adjourned, and that was about the meeting this evening.
Yes.
And Vince, is that going to be recorded so that we can view it later on the YouTube? All those, it wasn't on the agenda, so I wasn't sure. And because of the timing and another town meeting that's occurring, I'm not able to attend.
Okay, yes, it is going to be recorded. I'm pretty sure we're going to have a quorum of select board members. In fact, my understanding is hopefully all 5 will attend, and hopefully we'll get a quorum of coastal resilience members as well. But we'll just see what we can get. It is going to be available on YouTube after, and I must note that as far as I understand, this workshop at 4 o'clock will not feature public comment today. It is a workshop.
Thank you, Vince. Sarah?
In relation to that meeting, is it required for us to have a quorum? Because I might have to leave in the middle of it and then come back. I have an obligation.
So this has to proceed as is. If we have a quorum, well and good. If we don't, I'm going to have to seek advice on how to proceed. There's going to be a quorum of select board members anyway. So the meeting will still go ahead and still be recorded. It seems like Matt has better advice.
Yeah, Matt, please go ahead.
Yeah, I'm not sure I have better advice. A couple select board members are leaving at 5. So, if we start with 5, we might be at 3, we might be at 2. I think we continue on, is my guess. So, I doubt that we'll be making any decisions or doing any votes or anything tonight. I think so.
Well, we'll show up and see what happens. So we do have a motion on the floor from Matt Fee to adjourn. Is there a second?
Sure.
Thank you, Ian. Roll call vote. Gary Beller,
Aye.
Sarah Boyce,
Aye.
Peter Brace. Peter?
Aye.
Graham Durovich,
Aye.
Matt Fee,
Aye.
Ian Golding,
Aye.
Jen Carberg,
Aye.
Fritz McClure,
Aye.
and Mary Longacre, aye. Thank you all. We'll see some of you later.
Thank you.
Okay, going to stop the recording, Mary.